Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation and my comparison of the 6th and final volume of the Scott Pilgrim comic book series to the climax of the 2010 film adaptation. Okay, I've suggested that you guys read these comics before, but now I am straight up begging you to. Almost every page, every panel, and every sentence in this volume is a plethora of opportunities to psychoanalyze the characters and probably the author and self-reflect on what parts of them you see in yourself and whether or not you like that. I do not have time in this video to describe everything. Even if you watch this summary, you will be missing out if you don't buy this comic. Right, now that I've done everything I can, let's talk about the math real quick. Surprisingly, this last volume was allotted a comparatively whopping 18% of the film's runtime. That of course is meaningless if said runtime has nothing in common with said volumes, so let's take a look at both and see if that's the case. Scott gears up for battle and charges to Gideon's new nightclub. The surprisingly small bouncers ask for passwords, but they're all massive hipsters, so Scott's disinterest is sufficient to gain him entry. Scott rides the elevator down to the somewhat unusual club, which is brightly lit and built around a large pyramid throne for Gideon and Ramona. Sexbomb pause in their performance to try to dissuade Scott from humiliating himself further, but Gideon spies him and continues his smarmy tirade of false civility. Done with that shit, Scott challenges him to their final death battle. Gideon asks him why he's beating this dead horse instead of moving on, and Scott announces his love for Ramona. Having gained the power of love, a red flaming katana spawns from his heart, giving him a stat boost. An unimpressed Gideon commands Sexbomb to play some fighting music. Scott and his love sword make short work of his minions, but Gideon himself effortlessly shatters it. Before he can finish Scott, Knives shows up out of nowhere armed with knives and disarms him. Then she charges right past him to attack Ramona, apparently intent on getting revenge on her for hurting her beloved Scott. Gideon tries to sneak attack Scott, and the best choreographed love dispute in history begins. Gaining the upper hand on Gideon, Scott takes the opportunity to try to stop Knives, though his confession that there was in fact some overlap in their relationship doesn't exactly help matters, despite, or much more likely because, he tries pulling the "you weren't wronged because I cheated on her with you" line from Volume 5 on Ramona. The aftermath of this is interrupted by Gideon sneaking up behind Scott and running him through, killing him instantly. Scott's death takes the form of his desert dream / subspace highway, where Ramona meets him and reveals she's only with Gideon now because he's controlling her with a chip in the back of her head. Just as he's giving up hope, Scott is reminded that he has an extra life, which apparently takes him back in time to the moment he received it, so it's really more of a save point than an extra life, but whatever. Fast forwarding to entering the nightclub, he simply kills the bouncers instead of guessing the passwords, and this time he actually takes a moment to tell Stephen Stills and the band that he's proud of them, informs young Neil that he should be called Neil from now on, and apologizes to Kim for being a butt to her. Gideon attempts to restart their convo, but Scott skips ahead to the end, telling Gideon he's fighting for himself this time, and the power of self-respect becomes a significantly more powerful katana. Sexbomb play much more enthusiastically for Scott, and this time he overcomes Gideon when they clash. He tries to forestall Knives' attack, but she jumps in anyway. He opts to straight up tell them he cheated on both of them and takes responsibility for it. Gideon recovers and returns to the fight, powering up his real sword, which is... I mean, look at it, it's all pixelated and shit, I kind of love it. Knives decides to take part too, joining Scott in the fight, but even together they can't overcome Gideon, and Scott loses his self-respect sword. Unbeknownst to Gideon though, Ramona's control chip was destroyed in Knives' initial attack, and she drops the "let's both be girls" line before getting him right in the sausage and peas. Gideon kicks her down the stairs, which is such a dick move it inspires Knives and Scott to sync up like they used to do playing Ninja Revolution and combo him into submission. Scott finishes him off with a mighty kick and gets a shit ton of coins. Everything seems good until the ghost of Gideon tries to sick the nega Scott on them, which Scott insists on facing alone, though in an amusing anticlimax they just talk for a bit and agree to be friends. Knives makes peace with the fact that her relationship with Scott is really over, and Ramona makes to leave, but Scott insists on coming with her, and they depart together through a subspace door. Not a bad ending at all in my opinion, but I actually have some interesting information in regards to it, but that will have to wait. Right now we have the comic book to look at. The final comic starts with one of now many revisits to the desert world of Scott's dream mind, as he seems to be trying to catch up with Ramona but gets Gideon instead. And cutting to his waking hours, it seems Scott is dealing with, or more accurately, avoiding dealing with Ramona leaving him by regressing character-wise. He's stopped going to work, and he's been away from his band for so long Stephen Stills has formed a new one without him. He has a dream that Ramona impales him with the sword of love, and he's torn apart by demon versions of his ex-girlfriends. Yeah, it doesn't take long for the "holy holy shit, there are issues that need a lot of deconstructing here moments to start in this one. Wallace is of the opinion he should either fight Gideon or just move on with his life and start banging random women. Very, very unfortunately, Scott takes the latter advice to heart and propositions knives when he finds out she's just turned 18. Oh, Scott. Thanks for making me once again hardcore regret ever relating to you, buddy. Thankfully, Knives has finally done some developing of her own and turns him down. They share an extremely awkward and unsatisfying kiss, and that is it. Slightly dazed by his own awfulness, Scott wanders into a party that he assumes must be one of Julie's, because they usually are, but it turns out to be some randos he doesn't know, and Julie actually moved away a while ago. Envy Adams is at said party, and Scott tries to get the opening salvo of spite in for once, but surprisingly, Envy doesn't rise to it. She even meets him for coffee the next day, though Scott isn't receptive to any hatchet burying. Wallace remains entirely unsympathetic to Scott's determination to wallow in self-pity forever, and Kim invites him to come visit her in their old hometown. Though there is one positive moment where Gideon the cat finds Scott's new home and they are reunited. There's another depressing and poignant moment with Envy slightly later where it's revealed that despite what a profound effect their relationship had on Scott, he can't actually remember it. And there's also more hints that the reason for their breakup might not exactly be what Scott's been thinking it was this entire time, and might well be tied into his habit of forgetting that he drinks and exactly what he does when he's drunk. Scott then comes face to face with Gideon and promptly runs away. Wallace decides that enough is enough and forces Scott to go north for a bit and stay with Kim while he trains to fight Gideon. Scott not incorrectly points out that he doesn't have any motivation to fight him anymore. Why would one combat one's ex's evil exes? Kim doesn't seem all too happy there, but hasn't figured out what she wants yet. In general. They go for a walk and talk about deep things. Scott, in his continued quest to do the worst possible thing in any given situation, makes a move on Kim, stating he should be with her instead of Ramona because she's so much simpler. In addition to being understandably insulted by this, Kim is also shocked that Scott thinks that their relationship was all sunshine and rainbows. Not only does she remind him that Scott never bothered to tell her that he was moving away, letting that job fall to Lisa and causing a huge rift between the two girls, but it's finally revealed that Scott's flashback in Volume 2, involving Kim being kidnapped by Simon and him rescuing her, was a complete fabrication. Simon was in fact a normal young man and Kim's boyfriend, and by the looks of things, Scott beat the crap out of him before stealing her. The revelation that Scott has been remembering this so completely wrong makes his head glow just like Ramona's, quickly followed by the return of the nega Scott. Scott engages in battle, but Kim somehow immediately understands the situation is not what it seems and tells Scott he has to stop forgetting all his mistakes or he'll keep making them. Scott disagrees, but a sudden flood of memories of Ramona stop him and the nega Scott, and they violently merge into a single entity, resulting in Scott remembering everything he'd forgotten for the last decade or so. As a result, he no longer believes that he deserves to get Ramona back. Kim agrees, but tells him to try earning her back instead and sends him back to Toronto. Meanwhile, back in Toronto, it's revealed that Envy is dating Gideon, and he's managing the release of her solo album debut. He's also clearly a super arsehole. Scott storms into Gideon's newly opened club, which is apparently literally underground and sporting some pretty fucking cool shit like arcade machines, dancing cages, illuminated floors, and some crazy pyramid shit going on. Apparently, figuratively, everyone is there, including Wallace, Julie, Stacy, young Neil, who Scott jubilates by referring to just as Neil, Knives, Tamara, and Envy, who makes a rather dramatic entrance before starting to sing. Her first song starts with the lyrics "Look behind you," and fortunately Scott takes them literally, dodging Gideon's attempted surprise attack. Scott and Gideon exchange heated words, and Scott demands to know where Ramona is. In a surprise twist, it turns out Gideon was under the impression that she was still with Scott. This confrontation was a setup he had arranged in order to steal her from him. Angry about this turn of events, Gideon rips Scott's katana from his chest, robbing him of the power of love and his recent leveling up. They quote The Empire Strikes Back at each other as Gideon tries to get him to join the League of Evil Exes. When Scott refuses, Gideon assures him there are no hard feelings and stabs him through the heart, killing him. 3 blank pages later, Scott comes to in his mind desert. Lamenting his recent death, he is surprised to be confronted by Ramona in a sort of full circle callback to the first time they met in his head. Ramona informs him she's been away doing some soul searching. She's not necessarily back to get back together with him, she just wants to apologize to Scott for her constant selfishness and hypocrisy and whatnot. Once he realizes that Ramona doesn't hate him, Scott is only really interested in making out one last time before his soul goes off into that sweet good night. However, it seems that everyone, including him, forgot that he has an extra life. As he returns to the mortal realm, Ramona springs out of him like a goth Lolita Athena. Gideon is initially surprised, but realizes this means he can go back to his original plan, telling Envy to take a break so he can use the stage to show off Okay, bear with me. So, it turns out every time a girl broke up with Gideon, he had her cryogenically frozen and stored in a chamber. He seems to believe there is an end goal to this involving him dating all of them one day, but I'm not sure how that would work. I'm pretty sure Gideon is just cuckoo crazy pants, and unfortunately he wants to freeze Ramona too. He shoots a Hadoken-like blast at her, Scott, and a bunch of innocent bystanders, all of whom's heads start to glow. He also tells Ramona that the whole League of Evil Exes thing came about from a Craigslist article that he made while he was drunk, and even he was surprised that almost all of her exes signed up for it. Scott is instantly hostile towards Ramona, blaming her for dragging him into this fight and wanting out of the whole business. Ramona tries to tell him that this is Gideon's doing, but he's not really having it. Ramona decides that coming back might have been a mistake and tries to disappear again. Gideon rudely interrupts the process by running her through as well. Gideon then reveals that the glow is a side effect of the weapon he just used on them. He has the ability to trap a person inside their own head, tormented by their personal demons and suppressing positive emotions. The glow apparently utilizes subspace to get into people's heads, and unbeknownst to Gideon, Ramona had somehow harnessed that to use the glow to enter subspace at will. Ramona gives the "he has a way of getting into my head" line, though in this case it turns out she's referring to Gideon literally being in her subspace mind zone. At that exact moment, Scott realizes her bag of holding also utilizes subspace and crawls inside it, using it to travel into Ramona's mind. Gideon tells him this was a tactical error as he's all-powerful in Ramona's head. Despite this, and despite Gideon growing super huge and buff, Scott headbutts him so hard he infects him with the glow. Gideon claims this is nothing to him as he's been dealing with his personal demons his whole life, but it does seem to weaken him enough that Ramona regains control of her mind space. Every aspect of her personality teams up to tell Gideon to get the fuck out. In a last-ditch attempt to gain the upper hand, Gideon tries to kill Scott, but suddenly returning to the real world, you see Ramona has sacrificed her subspace bag to defend him. Everything inside comes flying out, including the love sword, which she claims healing her injuries. Gideon relieves his frustrations by being a dickhead to Envy, and seeing the similarities between them, Scott finally fully understands the fact that he has been the cause of pretty much all of his life's problems and how much he's hurt his friends. Much like love, this understanding is personified in the form of a bladed weapon. Gideon retrieves a sword that he hid in Envy's dress and tries to continue the fight, but is no match for Ramona and Scott at full power. Even his final attempt to emotionally manipulate them by telling them he's been spying on them by invading their minds, and he's the guy who messed up Scott's memories, is ineffective. Together they slash him into multiple pieces and coins rain down painfully on the crowd. Envy looks for a second like she might have beef with this, but it turns out she is equally happy to be out of Gideon's gravity well of emotional abuse. She performs her songs afterwards, and the very confused ex-girlfriends are released from their cryogenic prisons. After the performance, as people are leaving, the group interrogate Ramona about where she actually was all this time, and she admits she went to stay with her dad while she tried to find herself, but ended up just slobbing around all day watching TV. As they exit the club, Scott and Ramona have a hardcore heart-to-heart about their respective damage, and agree to try to make things work, even if it's not super easy. In a sort of epilogue chapter, we see that Scott has gotten his old job back, and even managed to get promoted to prep cook. He also finds out that Stephen Stills is dating Joseph now. Apparently he came out to everyone else in Volume 5, but decided Scott really wasn't ready for it yet. Kim and Scott have formed their own band in the absence of their former lead singer. Evidently Stephen Stills really was the talent, as they don't write their own songs anymore and suck so bad even Knives and Neil can't pretend to like them. This doesn't appear to be an issue though, as they're just doing it for fun now. Knives bids a tearful farewell to Scott as she prepares to leave town to go to university, though they do plan to keep in touch and remain friends. And finally, Scott meets Ramona at the top of the stairs where they met for their first date and fly off to do, I don't know, something in subspace. It's a good ending, okay? I caught the feelings from that last panel. The Dom's final thoughts. The Nega Scott moment is... it's a lot, okay? Just give me a few minutes because it's a lot. The most commonly accepted interpretation of the Nega Scott is that it's a personification of Scott's repressed memories and unwillingness to confront his sins. Every time he did something really bad or something really painful happened in his life, he chose to forget it rather than deal with it, and the resulting psychological issues were made into a living, moving, fighting monster. I don't think it was made clear if this is directly connected to Gideon and the glow, or just something that Scott could unintentionally do on his own because the world that he exists in is batshit crazy sometimes. His head does glow just before the Nega Scott Scott turns up, but his inability to remember anything predates him meeting even Ramona, let alone Gideon. His attempts to drive it away or fight it represent his continued attempts to not deal with his past, and by the same logic, the memory of Ramona finally making him stop fighting and him merging with it is him accepting the bad things he's done. I kind of love that it sounds like I'm describing an allegory, but it can also be taken 100% literally. He literally stops fighting and becomes one with a part of himself he doesn't like. However, when I first read this part of the book, I thought that perhaps it was building to something a lot more worrying. Kim had just explained to Scott that his fantastical memory of fighting an entire school and rescuing her from the clutches of a super-powered guy called Simon was entirely a fantasy of his own creation, and with that in question, the reader has to wonder how reliable not just his other memories are, but the events of the entire comic series. It would not be unreasonable to wonder if maybe everything in the present wasn't also being perceived through a Scott filter. Scott might actually be living a perfectly normal life in a perfectly normal world, and all the video game reality stuff is just his way of not growing up and providing him with an easy way of dealing with his adult life problems. Most notably, no matter how many times it comes up, he never has to deal with his or his girlfriend's emotional baggage from past relationships. He can just headbutt them so hard they burst. And then, as if to immediately reinforce this theory, when Scott is once again faced with a situation he doesn't want to deal with, right on cue, something he can fight instead conveniently appears, and Kim shouts that he can't keep living like this in a panel where, for some reason, you can't see the Nega-Scott. Was this scene trying to tell us that the entire series is nothing more than the fantasy of a deranged video game addict created to help him avoid real-life responsibilities, and the fact that he goes back into them in the climax is representative of him losing his last chance to return to reality? Probably not. There's quite a few holes in that theory, and I think I was just reading too much into it. Plus, as we discovered, the false memory from school was revealed to be Gideon's doing. It just had me worried for a bit though, and I'm still not entirely sure how Kim knew exactly what the Nega-Scott was, but perhaps having evil copies of yourself is a common thing in this world, like having a cold. There's a very similar, though somewhat darker fan theory that applies to the comic and the film that Scott is, in real life, simply an insane spree killer murdering his way through his girlfriend's ex-lovers, and the video game stuff is just his psychosis, but frankly, that's just a bit too obvious and dull of a theory to be worth dwelling on and can be filed away with the Ash Ketchum is in a coma stories. Moving on to the film's Nega-Scott, I personally think that it was an anti-climax joke, nothing more, nothing less. Though for the sake of fairness, you could read into it if you want to. For example, if Nega beings are supposed to be the opposite of the heroes, if Scott's double is kind of a nice person really, what does that say about him? You could also see them making friends as Scott accepting his faults like he did in the comic, but without the dramatic merging. So, the glow. Again, that whole thing was a lot, so please be patient with me. It's also, I would imagine, going to be a bit of a touchy subject for a lot of my audience because, let's face it, and please bear in mind this is just my interpretation of it and therefore subjective as fuck, but from the description Gideon provides for it, it's pretty clear to me that what he created was weaponized clinical depression that he could force on people. He describes it as trapping someone inside their own head with their personal demons and suppressing things like love and happy feelings as much as possible. He evidently uses it on all of his lovers to make sure they can never have the emotional stability to leave him, and apparently sells it in some capacity, either the ability to use it too, or possibly as some sort of hitman infecting people for money. The book's already established that subspace highways are a thing that lets you travel great distances quickly, and can also lead into someone's minds and dreams. Because the glow utilizes subspace to work, Ramona found a way to use her infection to travel into subspace at will, so she could escape from situations she couldn't handle. While Scott does get a top-up in the final battle, it's made clear he did have it before, though if Gideon did it to him or he caught it from Ramona like some sort of subspace STD isn't explained. Ramona being able to ride the glow into subspace being treated as a big deal confused me a bit. I mean, Lynette could also teleport out of a room at will, so it's clearly not that special a skill. Gideon saying he's been using subspace to enter Scott's head and mess with his memory also kind of threw me off. I mean, I thought they just established that Scott doing that to himself is what created the Nega-Scott. The glow is ultimately a little convoluted and confuses a lot of what could have been very clever messages about not repressing, having trust issues, and all manner of other things. Nope, all that happened because the glow. I was amused by how much use this volume got out of the power of love sword metaphor. Gideon stole Scott's love, Ramona healed her wounds with the power of love, that sort of thing. Moving on to the adaptation specific stuff, it's surprising how much of this volume was in the film, and or vice versa, probably more than the last two volumes combined in fact. Exact imagery imagery, direct line quotes. I for sure cannot say which came first at this point, but someone copied someone's homework here. I don't have any evidence to back this up, so I could be talking right out of my arse, but I think the clever misdirection at the end of the comic, where it turns out Ramona wasn't with Gideon all this time, and the League was nothing more than a drunken Craigslist post, is something that probably wouldn't have existed if O'Malley hadn't watched the film's intended ending. Getting to see how well it works with a predictable ending must have made it much easier to decide to take a risk with it, and reveal that nothing had gone the way that people expected it to, including Master Manipulator Gideon. It makes for entertaining second reading, seeing Gideon's attempts to goad Scott and Scott's attempts to avoid him, knowing that they both think Ramona is with the other one, is kind of hilarious. While both Gideons are successfully very hateable, this is achieved in slightly different ways. I'm going to be assuming for the sake of this comparison that Gideon wasn't using his control chip to sleep with Ramona, because that is just a whole new level of fucked up that I don't think Edgar Wright and the filmmakers would have gone to. Film Gideon is just such a slimy, smug, patronising douchebag you relish the sight of him getting kicked in the nuts. Despite this, he is kind of funny, as he has some genuinely witty lines. Comic Gideon is hateable because he's just the worst, the perfect asshole. I've not come across a hate sink this effective since Count Olaf or Professor Umbridge. Even if you were to ignore the superpowers he used to control people, he's still the poster boy for manipulative, abusive relationships. I can't speak with authority on the subject of coming out of the closet, but it seems pretty clear to me that Stephen Still's descent into madness trying to get the band's album sorted was clearly meant to be retroactively revealed to be a side effect of him struggling with his sexuality. Interestingly, word on the street is the actor, Mark Webber, was advised the character was gay and played him as such, even though it wasn't going to be acknowledged in the film. Even though Stephen Stills was not interested in Scott in any way in the comics, he does appear to be giving the Michael Cera version some smolder when they play together. Just for the record, I don't think Stephen Stills' homosexuality was omitted because the filmmakers had any issue with it. They ditched all the romance subplots that weren't Scott's, or the recurring joke that Wallace is a bit of a manslut. Even though I was sad to see that Sex Bomb broke up and never got back together in the comics, I have to admit it does kind of make sense. Even before he got it mixed up with his sexuality, Stephen Stills was always way more invested in taking the band seriously than Kim and Scott, who were just doing it for fun, so I think if they'd kept on going, he would have ended up getting frustrated and angry at his friends eventually. I personally think it's a better ending for him to join a different group and the other two to continue to just mess around. The film and the book differ on the nature of Scott's second weapon, and the film also flat out states that the power of self-respect is greater than the power of love, which is a bold move. If you listen closely, when Scott is entering the club for the second time, you can just hear his friends saying the comic book is better than the movie. I assume that's a little adaptation Easter egg from Edgar Wright. One small point of contention for the fanbase in this part of the story is, if what O'Malley has said post hoc is true, and death in battle just sends you back home having learned your lesson, then why did Scott need an extra life to avoid death, and why didn't he burst into coins like all his defeated foes? My personal assumption is it's because Scott is in the role of the player character in this world. In old school video games, bad guys can respawn, but if the main character dies, it's game over. Unfair, but it is in keeping with the world they've set up. Honestly, even if he would have respawned without the extra life, that would have been pretty bad. He would have lost the fight and his shot at saving Ramona. All in all, while this arguably isn't the best of the 6 comics, it's still a strong enough ending to be a satisfying wrap-up, and I think the film kept some of the best parts of it. Okay, let's talk about those final thoughts. I've been looking forward to this. It's been a while since I've had to do it to be continued. Well, I will see you in just a moment, my beautiful watchers. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to like, share, comment, and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thanks for waiting. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. that's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness the Dom, I can't do that, for you see, I am of the Fremen and we use water as currency here on Arrakis. I mean, you can have some if you really want, but I'm not sure how much use you're going to get out of it. Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and I will see you in the next episode.